Welcome back to my series on the future of surveillance in Australia. In my first video, we talked about smart cities and the social credit system in China. In my second video, we talked about predictive and smart policing, as well as the coronavirus. In particular, I started to address ideas about how the coronavirus may affect the future of surveillance with regard to the apps they've developed, such as the COVID Safe app, and security measures in places like South Korea. In this video, I'm hoping to tie together some of these ideas and actually come up with a few ideas about what our future could look like. In particular, our short-term future in the next 50 years or so. To do this, I'm going to be referring to Wendell Bell's probable, possible, and potential futures. In making people responsible, the possible, the probable, and the preferable, Wendell Bell addresses three different kinds of futures or ways of thinking about the future. Using these categorizations can be extremely helpful when thinking about the future, so let's jump into it. The probable. The probable future is that which is easily forecasted by taking specific situations or sets of circumstances and deciding on alternative courses of action. In this way, they allow us to imagine how our actions in the present will affect our future and therefore if we should change our present or not. What's interesting about probable futures is that they can be self-fulfilling or self-denying. Let me give you an example. If I tell you that two candidates are running for presidency and that candidate A will win in a landslide, you may decide it's a waste of time to vote for your preferred candidate, candidate B. If all of candidate B's supporters have the same train of thought, it's probable that candidate A will win in a landslide, all because of predictions of probable futures. Similarly, there are self-denying futures. For example, a school board learns that the schools they have will not be large enough to accommodate the amount of students they will have in 5 years' time, so they convince the city council to build even more schools. Thus, 5 years later, there is ample room for students, and this probable future prediction has been self-denied through an active decision to stop it and make it a not-so-probable future. In this way, probable futures can help us guide our present actions to better align with what we want our future to look like. So let's have a look at some probable futures for surveillance. Currently, the Identity Matching Services Bill is under works. It aims to establish a framework for the automated sharing of biometric data, in particular facial images between government agencies. This bill cites that it could be used to help identify a person where there are reasonable grounds to believe the person is acting suspiciously in the vicinity of a crowded public place and who may be planning an act involving hazard to the public, which could be used against almost anyone. When we pair this with the fact that we already have a Suspect Target Management Plan, or STMP, in place, which lists individuals who are identified through the risk management framework, we can begin to see that it would be very hard to escape the eye of the law. I should note that much like the risk assessment scores in America, the STMP is overwhelmingly made up of Indigenous people. If the Identity Matching Services Bill was passed, people who find themselves on the STMP, regardless if they really need to be there or not, would find themselves more obtrusively surveilled by police. Moxie Marlinspike, Twitter's former head of cybersecurity, points out that we should protect privacy for the sake of illegal activity. If we had these types of constant surveillance, like those permitted in the Identity Matching Services Bill, law enforcement would have dirt on almost everyone, where at this point enforcing the law would become selective and highly biased. Apps like the COVID Safe app, without a doubt, are a fantastic idea, if used correctly. My vision is that these apps could act as a sort of pathway for Australians to be more receptive of surveillance. Anna Bunn and Nick Thompson point out that the Australian government has in the past used stressful or emotional times as a way to push through new legislation. This makes it a real possibility that the coronavirus crisis could be used as a sort of scapegoat to heighten the surveillance capabilities of the Australian government. For example, the Identity Matching Services Bill could be enacted firstly as a way to supplement the COVID Safe app and assist with contact tracing, but could then be transitioned to assist policing efforts once the pandemic is over. The issue with this is that, like previously discussed in my last video, these types of smart policing are generally biased and aren't even all that accurate. Next up, we have preferable futures. These predictions ask people to be competent, effective, and responsible for their own actions. showcasing what the probable consequences of what they do are. Of course, in order to label a future prediction as preferable, we need to know what people actually want and what their ideas of preferable are. To do this, researchers often use the Delphi method, where they ask respondents whether some possible or probable developments would be good or bad. From here we can construct preferable futures. Of course, I'm not a scientist and I don't have a ton of money to conduct a study, but from reading online discussion and hearing about certain points of concern in the news, such as the COVID Safe app, I can deduce what a generalised version of a preferable future would be. Since the launch of the COVID Safe app, over 5.8 million Australians have downloaded the app, with overall 54% of Australians somewhat supporting or supporting the app, and 37% strongly opposed or somewhat opposed to the app. It's a clear assumption to say that overall Australians have welcomed the COVID Safe app with open arms. From this, we can imagine that a preferable future for many Australians is the future where these sorts of surveillance measures are used sparingly and only enacted in times of need, such as in pandemics. I would imagine the Identity Matching Services Bill to not be part of this preferable future. Back in 1985, Bob Hawke put forth the idea of a national identity card, which would be used to help stop tax avoidance and health and welfare fraud. A ton of people opposed this, even John Howard, who warned that it would be a draconian institution into the lives of Australians. So these sorts of laws, which would allow the government unprecedented access into our lives and the ability to surveil us even more efficiently, would generally not have a place in our preferred future. It's fairly naive to think that in a preferable future we could have all the freedom and ease of life that comes with advancements in technology, such as facial recognition, without the intrusion of our privacy. But that's a preferred future. We reap the benefits of having apps such as the COVID Safe app, along with the ease of mind knowing that the government will not use this data in other ways or use it as an avenue to introduce even more intrusive surveillance measures. Let's be real, the preferable future isn't all that interesting, so let's move on. Last but not least, we have possible futures. This is when we think about the wild card scenarios or black swan events. We ask ourselves, what is the most radically unbounded future I can think of? Here, our worst fears could be actualized. It imagines a path to the future which is radically different to the way we operate today. Hence, it's still possible, but not probable or even preferable. This is, of course, where those sci-fi movies about humankind's eventual destruction thrive. They utilize common fears we have as a society and actualize them, or sometimes even create them. Something known as prehistory of the future, where our understanding of the futures are pre-configured by media such as sci-fi films, which shape our attitudes towards technology in an often negative way. We could take what happens in China and apply these sorts of technologies to the possible future of Australia. It's possible that we start to have CCTV cameras on every street in every town, and that we introduce a sort of social credit system which forces us to be a good citizen, but this is unlikely. Given Australia's political system, a democracy, it's unlikely that these sorts of measures will ever have a place here. But that's not to say that these won't have adaptations. For example, imagine an app which is developed after the success of the COVID Safe app. It tracks wherever you go, can access your camera to watch what you do, it links up with sensors and cameras in cities to create a detailed ledger of where you've been, what you did, and who you did it with. Police could access this information and use it against you. Perhaps you're in the wrong place at the wrong time and are now being accused of committing a crime that you didn't commit. Or perhaps you're a minority who is unfairly targeted, since it's unlikely that these advanced forms of technologies will eradicate bias anytime soon. As Richard Erickson points out, suspects' rights are displaced by system rights. Justice becomes a matter of knowledge production for the efficient management of suspect populations. Professor Kafar, the executive director of the Optus Macquarie University Cybersecurity Hub, points out that these kinds of apps, like the COVID Safe app, have a common problem in that they build up a pretty detailed social graph for thousands of individuals. He notes that even though the COVID Safe app doesn't require us to use our real names, the authorities have access to our phone numbers and can still identify us. His general concern is that these technologies could be used later on as a mass surveillance tool. Although I don't think that the COVID Safe app itself will morph into what Professor Kafar talks about, his insight is valuable. The social graphs that these types of apps create are extremely valuable in a number of ways, equally useful for the police and the marketers who want to make sure that they place their billboards in the most effective spots for their target audience. So when you think about your future, how do you want it to look? If your answer is anything but the possible and potential futures I outlined, we need to start being proactive and educating ourselves on the possibilities of tomorrow's technology. Of course, this doesn't need to be a scary future. It doesn't have to be bad. But in order to make sure that it's not, we have to consider ourselves as active influencers who will help to shape the future we want.